Do you need to pass GED math? Then you're going to want to know how to beat systems of equations questions, also known as simultaneous equations. And in this video, I'm going to teach you two different methods you can use to get more of these questions right, so you can hopefully pass faster and get a higher score on GED math. The question on the screen says find the x and y values for the following system. And we have 3x plus y equals 9 and 4x plus y equals 10. So now would be a good time if you'd like to pause the video, try to figure this out, and if you get stuck or aren't sure how to do it, absolutely no worries because we're just going to go over it. So when I teach questions like this, I like to start by calling the first equation equation 1 and the second equation equation 2, and I think that just helps us to talk about it here as we go throughout the question. Now, these questions can be tricky not just to understand but also to teach. And the reason is because there are multiple ways to approach these questions. Now, the first method I'm going to show you here is the substitution method, and I'm also going to show you another method after that. So to use substitution, what you want to do is pick one of the equations, and it doesn't matter which one, but you just want to pick one of the equations, and then you want to pick one of the variables, and you want to solve that equation for the variable. So if you have no idea what I just said, don't worry because I know it does sound kind of confusing, so let me explain it here. So let's say that I pick equation 1, 3x plus y equals 9. So I pick equation 1, and the next thing I want to do is solve the equation for one of the variables. That's just a fancy way of saying I want to get one of the variables by itself on one side of the equation. And when I say variables, that's just a fancy word for an unknown. So in equation 1, the two variables are x and y. So again, the first step to solving this question is I want to pick one of the equations, and I want to pick one of the variables, and I want to solve the equation for that variable. In other words, I want to get that variable by itself on one side of the equation. So I have 3x plus y equals 9. Now, I could solve this for x if I wanted to, but usually when I see a variable that doesn't have a number in front of it, I usually like to start by solving for that variable. So I'm going to start by solving equation 1 for y. So what I'm going to do is subtract 3x from both sides of the equation. So if I subtract 3x on the left side, 3x cancels out. And when I subtract 3x from the other side, I end up with y equals 9 minus 3x. You could also write this as y equals negative 3x plus 9, two ways of writing the same thing. So again, I picked one of my equations, I picked equation 1, and I picked a variable, and I picked y as that variable, and I solved equation 1 for y, and I got y equals 9 minus 3x. So the next step is to take this 9 minus 3x and come down into my second equation, and I'm going to replace y with 9 minus 3x. So I'm going to plug 9 minus 3x in for y. So in other words, I'm going to take my equation 2, and I'm going to rewrite it this time, and when I rewrite it, instead of writing the letter y, what I'm going to do is write 9 minus 3x. So I just write 9 minus 3x equals 10. And so now what I want to do is solve this equation for x. So what is 4x minus 3x? 4x minus 3x is just x, right? Because 4 minus 3 is 1, and I keep that x, I bring the x along for the ride, so I just get x. Now, since I have positive 9 here, I want to subtract 9 from both sides of the equation. So what is 10 minus 9? 10 minus 9 is 1. So I get x equals 1. So I now have one of my answers here. I know that x equals 1. Okay, but we're not done yet because we want to also find the y value. So there are several different ways that I can do this. And what I think is probably the easy way to do it is to just take this y equals 9 minus 3x and replace this x with a 1 because we know that x equals 1. So let me rewrite this here. So y equals 9 minus 3 times 1. And 3 times 1 is just 3. So what is 9 minus 3? 9 minus 3 is 6. So I find that y equals 6. So my two answers here are x equals 1 and y equals 6. So let me just back up here. What did I say the first step was? Well, if you remember, the first step is to pick one of the equations, doesn't matter which one, and you want to pick that equation and solve it for a variable. So let's say instead I picked equation 2. So let's say I picked equation 2, and let's say I solved equation 2 for x. What would that look like? Well, what I'd want to do is I would start by subtracting y from both sides of the equation. So I would have 4x equals 10 minus y. So then the next step would be to divide both sides by 4. So if I do that, the 4's will cancel out on the left side, and I'll have x equals 10 minus y divided by 4. All right, so if you started it this way, the next step then would be to come up into equation 1, and you're going to take 10 minus y divided by 4 and plug that in for x in equation 1. Now, if you do the math and you work that all the way through, what you're going to figure out is that y equals 6. And then you'd get y equals 6, and you could come down here and plug it back in right here, plug the 6 in right here, and if you did the math, you'd figure out that x equals 1. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to work out all the steps here, but the point I want you to see is that there's really not a right or wrong way to do this, all right? As long as you pick one of the equations and you start by solving that equation for a variable. Now, you could have picked equation 1 and you could have solved it for x. And if you work it all the way through, you're still going to figure out that x equals 1 and y equals 6. So there's not really a right or wrong way to do that. Some ways might be easier than others. And that's why whenever I see a variable, a letter that doesn't have a number in front of it, I usually like to start by solving for that variable. But you don't have to do it that way. You could have started this by picking equation 1 and solving for x, or you could have picked equation 2 and solved it for x. It doesn't really matter. Like I said, there's not really a right or wrong way to start this out, as long as you pick one of the equations and solve that equation for the variable, and that's always going to be your first step. So that was the substitution method. This time, let me show you how to do the same question, and I'm going to show you how to do it with what I call the cancellation method. Sometimes I call it elimination, sometimes I call it stacking. And some textbooks call this the linear combination method, so just be aware that there are several different things to call this same process, but the idea is that I want to stack the equations on top of each other, and I want to make sure that the x is on top of the x, and the y is on top of the y, and the number is on top of the number, which we have here. And what I want to do is I want to pick one of the equations, and I want to multiply it by something, so that when I add the two equations together, one of the variables will cancel out. Now, I know that sounds really confusing, so let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to take equation 1 here, and I'm going to multiply it by -1. Now, I'm running out of room here, so I'm just going to squeeze my -1 right here. So I'm going to take equation 1, and I'm going to multiply everything by -1. So 3x times -1 becomes -3x, and positive y times -1 becomes -y, and positive 9 times -1 becomes -9. So again, all I did was I took 3x plus y equals 9, and I multiplied it by -1, and I got -3x minus 1 equals -9. So now I want to just take my equation 2, and I'm not going to change it. I'm just going to rewrite it down below. All right, so the next thing I want to do is just add the numbers. So -3x plus 4x is just x. -y plus positive y cancels out, so I can get rid of these. And then -9 plus 10 is positive 1. So by doing this, I see that x equals -1. So that would be a way we could get -1. Or sorry, did I say -1? I meant this. After we do this, we'll see that x equals positive 1. So as you can see, this is usually going to be a lot faster to do it this way compared to substitution. And it's just up to you to decide on the test how you want to do it. So you might be wondering, how are we going to get y now? So all I want to do to get y is I want to pick one of the equations here, and I want to solve it for y. So let me take, since I already showed you how to do it, let me take one and I'm going to solve it for y. So if I solve equation 1 for y, I would get y equals 9 minus 3x, right? And I already showed this in the previous part of the video. So I take one of the equations, doesn't matter which one, and solve it for y. And then what I want to do is take the fact that x equals 1, and I want to replace this x with a 1. Okay, so if we do that, we would see that we'd have y equals 9 minus 3 times 1. And the answer, as we already know, is 6. Okay, so the point here again is that this is one way to do it, and it's up to you to decide on your test how you would like to do it, if you want to use substitution or if you want to use the elimination, cancellation, whatever you want to call it method. I'm really excited to share this video's champion shoutout because it goes out to a successful test taker who passed the test some years ago and came back recently to share some insights that I think would be helpful for anyone who hasn't passed yet. And I'm not going to read every word of this comment just for the sake of time, but if you want to, you can pause the video and take all the time you need to read it. You're more than welcome to do that if you want to, but basically, she's right now in the process of getting ready to buy a house, and she's been packing, and she sat down to take a break from the packing and found one of her old math notebooks, and she had done a permanent marker drawing of Tommy in the notebook, which I love, and Tommy's right outside of my room right now as I record this. He's sitting outside the door waiting to get his food. When I'm done recording this, I'm going to give him his dinner, so he's out there anyway, so I'm sure he can hear me talking. I'm not sure if he can understand it or not with his cat brain, but I'm sure he'd be absolutely flattered if he could. And the test taker goes on to say, to everyone that is practicing for their GED and or high school diploma, you will pass and achieve your dreams. Practice little by little each day and you will get there. This was one of my issues because I was practicing every single day and falling asleep practicing, and I started to experience burnout. When that happened, I'd just study another subject, take a walk, practice self-care, or do something I enjoyed that gave me joy. Sometimes it was Olive Garden and eating something from the $5 menu. Now, there's so much value here in this advice, and it's been way too long personally since I've been to Olive Garden, but I was at Golden Corral a couple weeks ago, and yes, I did eat way more than I probably should have, but you know what, life's short, so I believe that every now and then you just gotta do that. So anyway, I just really love this comment and I wanted to share it here on this channel. So the next example says, if 8x plus y equals 20 and 4x plus 2y equals 100, what is the value of x? So at first, I'd like you to try to solve this by the substitution method, just for practice. And then after that, if you get stuck, don't worry, because I'm just going to break it down and I'm going to show you how to do it using substitution. And then after that, I'll give you a chance to try it using the linear combination or cancellation method. But let me give you a chance to pause the video and try this now. Okay, so how do we use the substitution method? Well, remember, we want to pick one of our equations, and we want to solve that equation for a variable. So let me call this equation 1, and let me call this 4x plus 2y equals 100. Let me call this equation 2. And again, I just like to label them just because I think it helps to talk about them. And so we're going to pick either equation 1 or equation 2. It doesn't matter which one. And we're going to pick a variable. And I'm going to take that equation that I picked, and I'm going to solve that equation for one of the variables. So that's always going to be the first step with the substitution method. Now, there's no right or wrong way to do this. Now, some ways might be easier than others. That's true. But there's no right or wrong way to do this. If you pick an equation and you solve it for a variable, and if you solve it for that variable incorrectly, that could be a source of error. And then also, as you go throughout the question, if you make an error in your calculation, that could be another source of error here with this. But as far as starting out goes, you just want to pick one of the equations, and you want to pick one of the variables within that equation and solve for that variable. Usually, whenever you're asked to solve for just one variable, okay, so if it says, what is the value of x? I'm going to pick one of these equations, and I think it's easiest to start by solving for y, because I see that I've got a y here and I don't have a number in front of it. So often it's going to be the easiest to pick that variable. So if I do that, I get y equals 20 minus 8x. And the reason I have 20 minus 8x is because I subtracted 8x from both sides. So I've got y equals 20 minus 8x. And the next thing I want to do here is come up to equation 2. And where I see this y, I want to plug 20 minus 8x in here for y. And so hopefully now it'll be a little bit more clear why I wanted to start by solving equation 1 for y. And the reason is because we're going to end up with just x's in equation 2, which is going to get us closer to the final answer, which is x. We want to find the value of x here. So if I do this, I end up with 4x plus 2 times 20 minus 8x. What is 2 times 20? 2 times 20 is 40. And I have to take this minus sign into consideration. So what is 2 times negative 8x? 2 times negative 8x is negative 16x. All right, and this is all equal to 100 still. So now I combine my like terms. So what is 4x minus 16x? 4x minus 16x is negative 12x, and I'm going to do 40 minus 100, or I should say I'm going to do 100 minus 40, because I subtract 40 from both sides. So 100 minus 40 is 60. So I have negative 12x equals 60, and I want to divide by negative 12 on both sides, and if I do that, I see that x equals negative 5. All right, and we don't have to solve for y here, so if we get x equals negative 5, we're done. That's the final answer. Tommy, do you have any tips you want to add? So now let me show you how you would do the question if instead of solving for y first, you started by solving for x. So let's say maybe you picked equation 1 and you decided to solve it for x. Let me just show you how you would do it that way, and if you do it that way, it ends up being more complicated, but it will still get you the right answer. So let's say you did 8x plus y equals 20. And you solved it for x. So the way that you would do that is you would subtract y from both sides. You would have 8x equals 20 minus y, and then you would divide by 8 on both sides. So you'd end up with this. You would get x equals 20 minus y all over 8. So again, if you picked example 1 here, or I should say equation 1, and you solved it for x, this would be your first step here. And if you did this, you can still get the right answer this way. It's just a little bit more complicated. So if you started by solving equation 1 for x, the next step then would be to take this 20 minus y over 8, and you'd come over to equation 2, and you would substitute 20 minus y over 8 into this equation for x. So here's what that would look like. So you'd have 4 times 20 minus y all over 8 plus 2y equals 100. So the way that I think is easiest to proceed here is to just do a simplification here, right? So I can simplify this down to 20 minus y over 4, over 2. So I could simplify this to 20 minus y over 2. And if you're wondering, why does that make sense? Let me show you. So if I just had 4 over 8, I could lower this fraction to 1 over 2, because 4 divided by 4 is 1, and 8 divided by 4 is 2. All right, so that's why I changed this to 20 minus y over 2. And if you have had any trouble following that at all, don't worry. What I recommend is checking out one of my videos where I talk about lowering fractions. I'll try to remember to put a link to that in the description below. So anyway, we get this 20 minus y over 2, and I have plus 2y equals 100. And so now this gets a little bit tricky. Since I've got a fraction here, in order to add 2y, I want to change this 2y into something that has the same denominator. So the denominator is just a big word for the bottom number in a fraction. So I can think of this 2y as 2y over 1. And if I multiply both the top and the bottom numbers by 2, I get a common denominator. And again, if you're having any trouble following this, I'll try to remember to put a link in the description to a video where I cover addition with fractions, because it's an important skill to know how to do, knowing how to get a common denominator. But again, basically what I wanted to do is I took this 2y, and I knew that it was 2y over 1, so I multiplied the bottom number, the 1, by 2. That gave me a 2 in the denominator, which is what I wanted. But in math, whenever I multiply the denominator by a number, I also have to do it to the numerator. So that's how I got 4y over 2. All right, and again, I know I'm throwing a lot at you right now, but I'll put a link in the description to a video where I talk about adding fractions. And if you're having any trouble following this, hopefully that will clear this up. But anyway, I've got 20 minus y over 2 plus 4y over 2 equals 100. So now what I'm going to do, since both of these fractions have the same denominator, I'm just going to write it all over 2. All right, so I have 20 minus y plus 4y, and I'm going to write this all over 2. Okay, and again, if you're having any trouble following this, I'll try to put a link. I'll try to remember to put a link in the description to a video that kind of clarifies how to get a common denominator. So basically, at this point, what I want to do now is I want to combine like terms. So I've got negative 1y plus 4y. I can rewrite that as positive 3y, because negative 1y plus 4y is positive 3y. So I now have 20 plus 3y over 2 equals 100. So what I'm going to do next is multiply by 2 on both sides. So I multiply by 2 on both sides, the 2's cancel out on the left, and on the right I end up with 200. All right, so I'm going to get 20 plus 3y equals 200. Okay, so now what I want to do is subtract 20 from both sides. All right, so the 20s cancel out on the left, and on the right, here's what we get. We get 3y equals 180. So now what I want to do is divide by 3 on both sides. So if I divide by 3 on both sides, what I get is y equals 60. Okay, so we're almost done. The last step is I want to come back up here into this equation, this x equals 20 minus y over 8. And I want to take this 60 and plug it in here for y. So let me show you what I'd get if I do that. So I see x equals 20 minus 60 divided by 8. So what is 20 minus 60? 20 minus 60 is negative 40. So I have x equals negative 40 over 8. And if I do negative 40 divided by 8, I get negative 5. So when all is said and done, I can find that the answer is x equals negative 5, all right? So hopefully you can see here that if you pick an equation and solve it for x in this scenario, you can get the right answer, but there's a lot more steps to get there, and there's a lot more places where you could potentially make an error, all right? So whenever you're asked what is the value of x, probably what you're going to want to do is pick an equation and start by solving that equation for y, and that's hopefully going to make it a lot easier than doing all these calculations to get the answer. But just know that you could do it this way if you wanted to. Tommy, do you want to teach the next example? All right, I'll just do it. So on screen we have if 8x plus y equals 20 and 4x plus 2y equals 100, what is the value of x? So this time I'd like you to, instead of using substitution, to try to solve this using elimination. So let me give you a chance now if you'd like to pause the video, try this out, and whenever you're ready, we'll go over the answer. And if you get stuck, don't worry about it because we're just going to go over it. So when I teach this method, I like to stack the equations on top of each other like this. And when you go to take the test, it's up to you to decide if you want to take the time to rewrite them like this or not. Totally up to you to decide that. But this is how I like to set them up when I teach this method. And we're asked, what is the value of x? So in my opinion, the fastest way to solve this is to make a change to one of these equations so that the y's will cancel out. Now, you could certainly do it the other way. You could certainly set it up so that the x's cancel out and you could solve for y. And then once you know what y is, you could plug that back into one of the equations to get x. You can do it that way and you'll get the same answer. But I think the fastest way to solve this here is to start by making a change so that the y's will cancel out. What I see here is that in equation 1, if we call 8x plus y equals 20, our equation 1, we have just y here, right? We've got 1y. And down here in our second equation, we've got 2y. So what I can do is I can come to my equation 1 here, and I can multiply everything by negative 2. So let me show you what happens when I do that. So what is negative 2 times 8x? Negative 2 times 8x is negative 16x. And what is negative 2 times positive y? Negative 2 times positive y is negative 2y. And what is 20 times negative 2? 20 times negative 2 is negative 40. So I now have negative 16x minus 2y equals negative 40. So this equation 2, this 4x plus 2y equals 100, I'm not going to change that. I'm just going to rewrite that down here. And so hopefully you can see that what I'm about to do is add these two equations. And since the y's are opposite, right, one is negative 2 and one is positive 2, the y's are going to cancel out. So what is negative 16x plus 4x? Negative 16x plus 4x is negative 12x. So what is negative 40 plus 100? Negative 40 plus 100 is positive 60. So I now have negative 12x equals 60. So what I want to do here is divide by negative 12 on both sides. And when I do that, I'll see that x equals negative 5. So the next question says, if negative 5x minus 3y equals 20 and 15x plus 4y equals 40, what is the value of y? And let's have you try this using substitution to get some practice using the substitution method. So please try solving this using substitution. And let me give you a chance now to pause the video, try to figure this out. And if you get stuck, don't worry about it because we're just going to go over the answer. Okay, so what I'm going to do to start out here is I'm going to take this first equation and I'm going to call it equation 1. And then I'm going to take the second equation and I'm going to call this equation 2. And I'm just doing this because I think it helps just to be able to call one equation 1 and equation 2 for teaching purposes as we work through the question here. And the first step with substitution is to pick one of the equations, and you're going to pick one equation and solve that equation for a variable. Now, as we've already mentioned before, there is no right or wrong way to do that. It's just some ways might get you the answer faster and easier than others. And since we're asked here, what is the value of y? In my opinion, the fastest way to get this correct using substitution is to pick one of the equations and start by solving that equation for x. So let's do equation 1. So I'm going to pick equation 1 and I'm going to start by solving this for x. So to do that, when I say solve for x, what I mean is that I want to get the x by itself on one side of the equation. So the first thing I'm going to do here is add 3y to both sides. So why am I adding 3y to both sides? Well, because this minus 3y will cancel out on the left side. So when I rewrite it, I'll have negative 5x equals 20 plus 3y. So now I can divide by negative 5 on both sides. So on the left, if I divide by negative 5, the negative 5s will cancel out. And if I divide by negative 5 on the right, I'll be left with 20 plus 3y divided by negative 5. Okay, so again, just to recap here, what I've done was I picked equation 1, and I solved equation 1 for x, and I got x equals 20 plus 3y over negative 5. Okay, so now what I want to do is come up to my equation 2 here, this 15x plus 4y equals 40, and I'm going to take this x and I'm going to replace the x with 20 plus 3y divided by negative 5. So let me write this out. So when I rewrite it, I'll have 15 times 20 plus 3y divided by negative 5 plus 4y equals 40. So what I can do now is do 15 divided by negative 5, and that's negative 3. So I can rewrite this now as negative 3 times 20 plus 3y plus 4y equals 40. Now, for teaching purposes, I'm taking the time to write out each step here. When you do your work on your own for the real test, it's up to you to decide if you want to write out every step or not. But what I'm going to do now is distribute this negative 3. And I have to keep this negative sign in mind here. So negative 3 times 20 is negative 60. And negative 3 times positive 3y is negative 9y. And then I still have this plus 4y equals 40. So now let me combine like terms. So let me do negative 9y plus 4y. So negative 9y plus 4y is negative 5y. So I'll have negative 60 minus 5y equals 40. Okay, so now let me add 60 to both sides here. So I'll add 60 to both sides here. And I'm running out of room, so I'll rewrite up here. So after I add 60 to both sides, the 60s cancel out on the left, and on the right I'm going to get 100. So I'm going to have negative 5y equals 100. So the last step here would be to divide by negative 5 on both sides. So when I divide by negative 5 on both sides, what I'll see is that y equals negative 20. So when all is said and done, the correct answer here is negative 20. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through how to do this, but you could, at the first step here, you could have picked one of the equations and you could have started by solving that equation for y. And if you did that and you followed the steps all the way out, you'd get the same answer. But in my opinion, I think it's easier in this case, since it's asking what is the value of y, to pick one of these equations and start by solving that equation for x. Okay. But when all is said and done, as long as you do all the math right, you would get the same answer, and that answer here is negative 20. Last chance, Tommy. Any math advice you want to add? No? All right, thanks anyway. So please try solving this using the elimination method to get some practice using elimination. So let me give you a chance now if you'd like to pause the video and try to figure this out. And if you get stuck, don't worry about it because we're just going to go over the answer. So when I teach this method, I like to start by stacking the equations on top of each other like this. And I like to do this just because I think it's easier to see this way. But when you go to take your test, it's up to you to decide if you want to take the time to write them out like this or not. But anyway, there are two different ways that we could approach this here using the elimination method. We could either set it up so that the x's will cancel when we add the equations, or we could set it up so that the y's cancel when we add the equations. And since we're asked, what is the value of y here? I think it's easier to start by making a change so that the x's will cancel out when we add the equations. So that's what I'm going to show you here, but just note that if you wanted to set it up and then set it up so that when you add the equations, the y's cancel out, you'll still get the correct answer if you do it that way. It's just it might take you a little bit longer. So anyway, what I see here is that I've got negative 5x in the first equation, and I've got 15x in the second equation. So in order for the x's to cancel out, I want to have opposite numbers in front of the x's. So if I have positive 15x in this equation down here, if I make a change to this equation up here so that this becomes negative 15x, the x's are going to cancel out when I add. So if I multiply this negative 5 by 3, I'm going to end up with negative 15x, which is what I want, because then the x's will cancel when I add the equation. But I have to also multiply everything else by 3 as well. So what is 3 times negative 5x? Well, 3 times negative 5x is negative 15x. And what is positive 3 times negative 3y? That gives me negative 9y. And what is positive 3 times 20? Positive 3 times 20 is 60. Okay, so as you can see here, I'm going to multiply the first equation by positive 3, and doing that gave me negative 15x minus 9y equals 60. Okay, so now I'm going to take my equation 2, and I'm just going to write it down here. So I have 15x plus 4y equals 40. Okay, so now what I want to do is add the equations together. And when I do that, negative 15x plus 15x cancels out. Negative 9y plus 4y gives me negative 5y. And 60 plus 40 is 100. And ignore this little dot here. That's not supposed to be a decimal or anything. I'm not sure how this dot got in here, but just ignore it. When I do 60 plus 40, I get 100. So I'm now left with negative 5y equals 100. And to finish this out, I want to divide by negative 5 on both sides. So if I divide by negative 5 on both sides, what I find is that y equals negative 20. So that's the correct answer here. Solve the equations negative 5x minus 4y equals 20 and 3x plus 2y equals 40 and express your answer as an ordered pair in the form xy. So let me give you a chance now to pause the video, try to figure this out, take all the time you need, and if you have any trouble with this, don't worry because we're just going to go over it. Okay, let's talk about this question. So I didn't tell you whether to use elimination or substitution. For this, I kind of left it up to you to decide which one you wanted to use here. And I'm going to show you first how to do this using substitution, and then I'll go through it using elimination. So the first step for substitution is to pick one equation, and you're going to solve that equation for a variable. So let me call this equation equation 1, and let me call this equation here equation 2. Now in this case, we have to find both x and y. So it doesn't really matter where I start here. Some ways might be slightly easier than others, but just from looking at the question here, it's hard for me to really tell what would be the easiest way to start. So I'm just going to randomly pick one of these equations, and then I'm going to randomly pick a variable to solve for. So I'm just going to go with equation 2, and I'm going to pick to solve equation 2 for y. So basically, the first thing that I want to do to solve for y is subtract 3x from both sides of the equation. So I'd have 2y equals 40 minus 3x. So now what I want to do is divide both sides of the equation by 2. So when I divide by 2 on the left side, I'm going to be left with just y because the 2's will cancel out. And on the right side, I'll get 40 minus 3x all over 2. Okay, so now the next step is to go back into the other equation, equation 1, and I'm going to plug 40 minus 3x over 2 in place of y. So when I rewrite this, I'll have negative 5x minus 4 times 40 minus 3x over 2 equals 20. Now, since I've got 4 divided by 2 here, really it's negative 4 divided by 2, I can simplify this even further. So what is negative 4 divided by 2? Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. So I can simplify this to negative 5x minus 2 times 40 minus 3x equals 20. So now what I do is I distribute this negative 2. So in other words, I'm going to do negative 2 times 40, which is negative 80. And I also do negative 2 times negative 3x, which gives me positive 6x. And this is all equal to 20. So now let me combine like terms. So what's negative 5x plus 6x? That's going to give me just x. So I'll have negative 80 plus x equals 20. So how do I get the x? We're almost done here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add 80 to both sides of the equation. So I add 80 to both sides of the equation, and I see that x equals 100. So we're not done yet because in this case, we want to find both x and y. So the first number in my pair is going to be 100. So now I want to find y. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to go back up here to where I solve for y. So I have this y equals 40 minus 3x over 2. And I'm going to replace this x with 100. Okay, so I'm running out of room here, but I'm going to try to make this work anyway. So when I rewrite this, I'll have y equals 40 minus 300. And the reason it's minus 300 is because this 3 times 100 gives me 300. So I'd have 40 minus 300 over 2. Okay, so 40 minus 300 is negative 260 over 2. So what is negative 260 over 2? Negative 260 over 2 is negative 130. So y equals negative 130. So if I do it by substitution, you would see that x is 100 and y is negative 130. So the ordered pair would be 100, comma, negative 130. So that's one way you could get the answer if you did substitution. Now, of course, if in your first step, you might have picked a different equation than I did, you might have picked a different variable than I did. But as long as you got 100 and negative 130, then using the substitution method, then consider that you got the right answer. Let me rewind and show you now how you could do this using elimination. So when I teach the elimination method, what I like to do is stack them on top of each other here. And it's totally up to you to decide if you want to take the time to write them out like this on your test or not. But this is just how I like to do it when I teach it. And the idea here with the elimination method is that I want to set it up so that either the x's will cancel when I add them, or so that the y's will cancel when I add them. Now, in this case, we could do either x or y. It doesn't really matter here. So basically, what I want to do, what seems easiest to me, is to set it up so that the y's will cancel. And the reason that this is the case is because I see in my equation 1 here that I've got negative 4y. And in my equation 2, I see that I've got positive 2y. So if I multiply everything here in this second equation by 2, what's going to happen is that this positive 2y is going to become positive 4y. And so when I add the equations, the y's are going to cancel out. And then I'm going to solve for x, and I'm going to use that x to figure out the y. And if that sounds really complicated, don't worry, because it should hopefully make more sense as I walk you through it here. So again, what I'm going to do is start by multiplying everything in the second equation by 2. So 2 times 3x is 6x, and positive 2 times 2y is 4y, and 40 times 2 is 80. Okay, and so I'm just going to take this negative 5x minus 4y equals 20, and just leave it exactly as it is. So now let's add the equations up. So what is negative 5x plus 6x? Negative 5x plus 6x is just x. Negative 4y plus 4y cancels out. And 20 plus 80 is 100. So I would see that x equals 100. Okay, so now what am I going to do to get y? Well, I'm going to take one of these equations, it doesn't matter which one, and I'm going to solve it for y. And I'm going to plug x in for 100. So again, that might sound super confusing, but once I break it down for you here, hopefully it won't be as complicated. So let me take equation 1 here and solve it for y. So what would that look like? Well, if I've got negative 5x minus 4y equals 20, the first move I want to make is I want to add 5x to both sides. So I'll get negative 4y equals 20 plus 5x. Okay, so now what I can do is divide both sides by negative 4. So if I divide both sides by negative 4, what's going to happen is that I'm going to get y equals 20 plus 5x over negative 4. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 100 and I'm going to plug it in here for x. So what is 5 times 100? 5 times 100 is 500. So I can rewrite this as y equals 20 plus 500 divided by negative 4. So if in my calculator I do 20 plus 500 and divide by negative 4, I'm going to get negative 130. So we would figure out that y equals negative 130.